Um, I'm going to go back to Stephen for a moment, and I want to ask you, Stephen, about the GCC and the sense in the GCC and what you've picked up from just you know people, policymakers across society about the reverberations of this war. So we've seen the economic impact fairly clearly, the impact on the oil industry and oil prices and their economies. But there's also this aspect of the questions that are being asked in the GCC about the future relationship with the US, the future of the bases, the military bases that we've also now seen reporting that these military bases have, some of which have sustained far greater damage than we had realized, thanks to CNN's reporting, and NBC and others have done pieces of this reporting. So the future of the relationship with the US, maintaining these bases that the Gulf states invested so much money in and thought that this is the ticket to their protection. So anything you've gathered on that from your reporting, and also and sort of the economic consequences of the war and social ones in the GCC. And I think it's also a chance for you to talk about the restrictions that have we've seen in various GCC countries.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good questions. It does feel, in a sense, like there's a reckoning delayed in the GCC. There's a lot of questions around this, the U.S. security relationship, which has been fraying for years now, if not several decades. The U.S. has been seen, I think the height of Gulf confidence in the U.S. was the Iraq invasion and the response to the Iraq invasion in 1990, when the Americans sent hundreds of thousands of troops into Saudi Arabia to restore Kuwait. And ever since then, really, I think the Gulf states have been wanting that level of sort of a bear hug from Washington. Um, and they've felt sort of one administration after another that they were being disappointed. I think it started with Obama with the original Iran deal that they felt was negotiated behind their backs, and not taking into consideration all of their concerns, which were not just the nuclear program, but also Iran's missile program, its support for militias across the region, its intervention in their domestic affairs. So I think it started there, and for Saudi Arabia, I think the lack of an immediate response to the Abqaiq attacks, the attacks in their oil fields back in 2000, that was 19, was it? 18, 19? Everything's squishing together now. Uh, the sort of lack of an immediate response, I think, um, raise more questions about how much can we rely on the U.S. You saw a diversification. I think that was led by the UAE, but also we've seen it Saudi Arabia looking at alternative partners, not necessarily security partners, but looking to diversify. Recognizing that there is no replacement for the U.S. For these countries. In some ways, I think they feel a little bit stuck because they're with the U.S. They've bought billions of dollars of high tech equipment, um, and it's not easy to pivot to another security provider if there were one available. But what we have seen, I think the initial reactions, which I think we'll see more of in the months and years to come, is you've seen the UAE get a lot closer to Israel, deepen that relationship, which began in 2020. I mean, the official relationship began in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. It goes back quite some time, sort of secret security dealings. Um, that's deepened quite a bit. You've also seen the UAE and other countries partner with, for example, the Ukrainians on anti-drone capabilities. I think the French, the Italians have been seen as really reliable partners, swooping in to help support these countries' defenses. The Pakistanis sent in number of jets to Saudi Arabia after the ceasefire began. So a diversification of those relationships. It does seem from everything that we can tell, and that reporting you mentioned, that U.S. bases were really hammered across the region in ways that took a lot of took I think most people by surprise. Um, there's a question of we don't really know how bad it is. We've gotten little snapshots into damage. How much is it going to cost to rebuild? Is it worth rebuilding? Is it worth building in a different way, or building the bases in different places? Um, I think those are questions that will have to, be borne out with time. Uh, I think there is a popular kind of response in many of these countries to the relationship, which is sort of as the way you framed it, as why were we relying on these guys? They were sort of they didn't protect us in our time of need. I think there's also a among a lot of the security officials an awareness that it wasn't perfect, but that the bases being hit. Um, the bases are the tip of the iceberg in terms of the security relationship. The bases are part of a relationship that give these countries access to high-tech weaponry, which served them generally pretty well. The damage is worse than it's really ever been in these tit for tats going back the last few years, but nowhere nearly as bad as it could have been had these sort of air defenses been not been in place. So I think there's a bit of sort of calibrating between that popular reaction and the official sort of security establishment. And there's also, I think, some questioning around, the Gulf is not a monolith, and different countries are affected differently. Kuwait and Qatar, for example, are completely cut off from exporting fuel, oil and gas, which is their lifeline. Bahrain is as well, but Bahrain will be supported by big brothers in the region. Qatar and Kuwait will be able to, if they need to, burn through a lot of their savings, their investment fund, liquidate some of their investment fund. It's not ideal, but they're not going to go broke. Saudi and the UAE at the moment are continuing to export a decent amount through these alternative pipelines at a much higher price, so they're actually doing okay in that regard. But I think there is a bigger question about the economic viability of these models that are based on openness, trade, foreign investment, tourism, when you're in a region that your geography sort of locks you in to a problematic dynamic with Iran and Iran's allies. And so that's why, and to go back to sort of this reporting from my newspaper and others around whether the Gulf countries wanted, whether Saudi and the UAE were pushing for war, what their position is. I think there was largely a sense before the war started that these countries would rather avoid direct conflict because of the dire economic consequences. But that since the war has begun, they do not want to be left with an Iran that is still capable of threatening them, that's more belligerent, that's aggrieved even more than it was before, that has proven its ability to close the straits and its ability to and sort of broken the red line of striking U.S. bases, oil infrastructure, economic infrastructure across the Gulf. So now they're sort of in a place where they wish the war hadn't started, but it has, and they're concerned about it ending before the threat is removed.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. I see one question in the chat, so I'm going to ask it. It seems it's a question that everyone can jump in and answer this. And actually, so this is a question from William, and I'll make a slight adjustment, or I'll add something to it as well, because I think Heidi can give us some perspective about Syria on this. So this is William's question. Can any semblance of stability be recreated through diplomacy, or have the U.S.-Israeli wars in Iran and Lebanon created long-term volatility that lasts for years? I think all of you can weigh in on this, but this question also made me think a little bit about, in terms of long-term volatility, of the spillover. We've talked about Iraq, we've talked about Iran, we've talked about Lebanon, we've talked about Israel here. We haven't talked very much about Syria, where there has been some spillover, although the worst case scenarios maybe weren't right. We sort of were seeing that early. Some early speculation in March that Syria might get involved in the war. Syrian forces might confront Hezbollah. So I'll start with you,
Yeah,
Heidi, on that.
which yeah, I mean, it was interesting, right? I was actually in Lebanon just before the war started, and speaking to people in Lebanon, including my colleagues who are asking, like, what is going on? Is Syria going to invade? And I almost wanted to say, like, oh, baby, we don't think about you at all. Like, nobody in Damascus was talking about it at this point, but it was very much a Lebanese preoccupation, which obviously there is a deep history there of Syrian invasion and occupation of Lebanon, so it doesn't come from nowhere. But the situation in Syria would have been very, very different if this had broken out before December of 2024, right? When we had the Assad regime in power here, where there was a strong presence of Iranian militias across the country, particularly in eastern Syria. You had, Hezbollah presence and history here in this country. It would have played out very, very differently here if the Assad regime was still in power. And I remember having a conversation with my housemate the day that the war started, when Israel and the US launched those strikes on Iran. And my bosses immediately said, go to Lebanon, right? Like it's going to start there. It hadn't yet. It took a sort of 36 hours. And my housemate was saying, should I be worried? Like, why are they sending you away? Is something terrible going to happen here? And I said, oh no, they're sending me away because nothing terrible is going to happen here. Like something terrible is going to happen next door. But Syria has escaped, yeah, largely unharmed. There were a few strikes on US bases, most of them actually after the US had emptied them. I don't know if anybody gave the Iranian militias in Iraq a heads up that the US was actually gone by the point that they struck some of those bases. And it's remained largely untouched. And actually, there has long been discussion about, now that Syria is stabilizing, whether it becomes a land route from, Saudi through to Turkey, whether it becomes a route for energy, but also, infrastructure in terms of like fiber optic cables and internet and all that kind of stuff. And we are starting to see the sort of lo-fi beginning of that, right? Like there has not been enough time or money to rebuild pipelines, to lay fiber optic cable, or to do any of those kind of big grand ideas that are being talked about. But they're trucking oil across Syria right now. Countries are exporting oil. They're crossing it from Iraq all the way across Syria and to Syrian ports on the Mediterranean, which are now starting to export oil from the region. And it's not enough scale to really be worthwhile for anyone right now, but it's definitely a beginning. And I think that's something that a lot of people here in Syria are hoping will become more possible and it can be done at scale. But yeah, the atmosphere here, when the war broke out, talking to people was like, oh, thank God for once this has nothing to do with us.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this very open-ended question, long-term volatility? Nabih.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I have a thesis actually about all this, which is that U.S. diplomacy in the region, because that really is what we're talking about when we talk about diplomacy in the region, right? The issue is that I would argue that really over the last few decades, we have seen a sort of organizing principle of U.S. diplomacy where essentially people of the Middle East, who are not Israeli, are essentially livestock. So that basically, people in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, Iraq, etc., these places, the people there, the residents there are essentially like cows and sheep, right? They don't have rights per se. They have economic comfort, right? You provide them with some economic comfort so they can produce for you. But this notion of rights and democracy and right to sort of determine one's fate, these are not really meant for those peoples, right? They are exclusively presented to Israelis. And really that thesis I think holds if you look at the way that well, the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration talk about legitimate grievances of these peoples, right? This notion that, for example, that Lebanon or the Lebanese will just simply sort of wave a wand and want to have peace with Israel, just ignoring the decades of grievances, right, against them. This really, this is the sort of ethos that you find from most U.S. diplomats, and the fact is, it will not work, right? There are legitimate problems and grievances that need to be dealt with, and the fact is that I haven't seen yet a single U.S. diplomat address those grievances, talk about them in a realistic fashion. We hear these grand plans about economic zones between Lebanon and Israel, right? Or this idea that, oh, we're going to have, vetted journalists visit each other. Yay, right? But the fact of the matter is that there are certain things that need to be dealt with, right? There are certain rights, right? And certain issues that have never been resolved properly. And whereas now, for example, Syria has actually managed to, I suppose, be relatively unscathed by all of this. The fact of the matter is that we are seeing volatility there happen as well, because Israel has occupied a territory larger than Gaza, right? A Syrian territory that's larger than Gaza. And I should add that it also has now control of about 40% of Syria's southern water infrastructure, which in turn means that it has a knife to Jordan, because Jordan relies on that water to be able to fulfill its needs. It's worth noting that Jordan is, I think, the second most it's the second most water poor country in the world. All this is to say that I don't think American diplomacy, as we have seen it, right, will actually be able to enact any kind of stability, and that volatility will remain to be the case, especially because we've seen no restraining force on Israel. We are now talking about an imperial Israel in the Middle East that will talk about the notion of Greater Israel Project quite openly and quite happily. And with that in mind, of course, there will be no stability. How can there be with that situation? It is impossible.
Yeah, because eventually we'll need a buffer zone for the buffer zone.
Yes, that's where we're headed.